Just like magic. Hello everybody and welcome to our 5 Freedoms at 50 Animal Welfare Hangout. I know that many of you have joined us from the massive open online course that we run with the University of Edinburgh, Animal Behaviour and Welfare. Others have joined because you have followed SRUC on Twitter, or perhaps because you've heard about us through our schools programmes. I would like to introduce myself first. I'm Jill Mackay and I'm a researcher here at SRUC. And I have with me today Professor Alistair Lawrence, who is a chair of Animal Behaviour and Welfare at SRUC and at the University of Edinburgh. And you used to lead our Animal Behaviour and Welfare team at SRUC, and now you're doing more research. You've stepped back from the managerial role to do more of the research side of things. Is that correct?
That's exactly right, Jill. Yeah, I've been managing people for close on 25 years, maybe longer actually. And actually, laterally, I took on the management role of the whole of the animal and veterinary sciences at SRUC, which was a taxing, interesting job. Anyway, yeah, I'm going back to my roots, and I'm currently investigating a couple of things which have interested me for a long time. And one of those both probably directly relate to some of you. One is I've got interest in play behavior and otherwise in positive welfare in animals. And I'm also interested in how young people, before the age of 10 and also adolescents, see animals and animal welfare, and also how they see their responsibilities to animals as well.
Really interesting projects. I really like the duty of care projects that Alistair works with. I find them really fascinating. So if you've never joined a Google Hangout before, there's a couple of ways you could be watching this. You could be watching it on Google, in which case if you go to the left-hand side of your screen, I think it's that way, I always get confused, and click on the Q&A app, you'll be able to ask us questions live, and we'll pick out your questions and we'll answer them live as we go. If you're watching this on YouTube, either live or after the fact, please remember to like the video, share it and subscribe it. I'll talk a little bit more towards the end about why that's important, the kind of public engagement things we're trying to do here at Scotland's Royal College. But at the moment, just give it a like and a subscribe, send it to all of your friends. Hopefully you'll enjoy the video. We've got a lot to get through, and what I'm going to do is start with what actually the 5 freedoms are. And they came essentially from a report in 1965. I'm just going to double check the date, but it was, yes, 1965. And it was Professor Bramble who was tasked by the UK government to look into the standard of living of the production animals in the UK. And Professor Bramble recommended that all animals in the UK should have the freedom to do certain things, such as stand up, lie down, turn around again in their shelter. The Farm Animal Welfare Council then formalised these into the 5 freedoms, what we know as the 5 freedoms today. This is around about 1979 when they formalised them properly. And they are the freedom from hunger and thirst, the freedom from discomfort, the freedom from pain, injury and disease, the freedom to express most normal behaviours, and the freedom from fear and distress. One of the very first questions that we had, and I think is a really good question, came from, I'm going to try and get everybody's names right, but please accept my apologies if I pronounce somebody's name wrongly. So we had a question from Linda Koch and also from Melissa Day from Milton College, and Linda is from a horse rescue organisation. And Linda was saying that normally she takes in horses which have been starved or in some way mistreated by being denied lots of food. And she was saying, how does the freedom from hunger and thirst actually come into this? Because the last couple of horses that she rescued were actually obese. So they'd kind of been given too much freedom from hunger and thirst. And how did the 5 freedoms consider this? And Melissa was also asking this question, but she was asking it from the point of view of nutrition companies that provide animal feed. And she was saying, do they have a responsibility to this freedom as well? So it was one of the first things we talked about when we started looking at these questions, was how rigid how rigidly should you interpret these 5 freedoms? Is it the freedom from hunger and thirst, or is it actually the freedom to have a good diet, an appropriate diet? And well, we looked up the actual 5 freedoms as they are, as the Farm Animal Welfare Council describes them now. And could you remind me of the exact wording on our second screen?
Oh, sorry.
It was on there, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So as the, here we go. So this is from the Farm Animal Welfare Council's advice to the government at present. And it's phrased as the freedom from hunger and thirst by ready access to water and a diet to maintain health and vigour. Obviously, maintenance of health and vigour also incorporates not having too much food to get an animal into an obese state. So it's about giving them a diet, giving the animals a diet that maintains their health. And this is one of the questions that I get asked quite a lot by my undergraduate students. I think another one that they talk about is the freedom from fear and distress. Is it not good that an animal should feel fear in a situation where that is appropriate? So, for example, where there is a potentially dangerous situation and fear helps that animal to escape from that situation, does that mean that they're not following the freedom from fear and distress? So I don't know if you want to talk about how the freedoms should be applied to the animals that we manage.
Yes, it's a complex set of issues which are raised in that quite simple question.
It's a very good question.
Very good question. So I guess the first starting point is that the freedoms as they were concocted by the Farm Animal Welfare Council based on the Bramble report were obviously intended to be catchy, if you like, to get across in a very few number of words a set of important principles. And since feeding and drinking are essential to animals in a whole raft of different ways, then it's not surprising that they have chosen hunger and thirst as one of the important aspects here. And it's also good that they chose to describe this in emotional terms. And that, of course, runs through, it's a thread that runs through the freedoms, is that by and large, these are described, we could always have we could have another whole set of arguments about this, but these are described from the animal's perspective. So we are expecting the animal to respond to the way we feed and drink it with emotions. Some of these are good and some of these are bad. But of course, just strictly taking freedom from hunger and thirst raises the sorts of issue which we have here from Linda, which is, okay, horses can be starved, and I've seen plenty of those. But here's an example of a couple of horses that actually have had plenty of food. It's just that they've not been managed appropriately in relation to how much food or the type of food that they're being offered. And in fact, the question is, should you consider this abuse? So the wording, at least as far as the 5 freedoms are concerned, what has happened over the years is that the Farm Animal Welfare Council, FAWC, as it's now often referred to, has added to the freedoms these additional words, which are intended to get across the complexity of what's involved here. So it's not just making sure your animals have enough food or enough water, it's making sure that they have access to that they're not having to overly compete for it, and also that the type of food that's being offered and the amount of food, all of that is in balance, just as you would expect for looking after kids or humankind. You know, it's exactly the same sort of principles. So it is a good question, but in fact, as far as the freedoms themselves are concerned, at least in the UK, how they are projected now, to some extent that's taken care of by these additional words and the sort of complexities that are being addressed in the additional words.
And I think also taking all of the 5 freedoms together, you can't just look at one freedom and say that by addressing one freedom you are ensuring there's good welfare. You have to look at all 5 of the freedoms together as a whole, because clearly obesity violates the freedom from pain, injury, and disease, because obesity limits the animal in physiological ways. So you do have to also think of them all together. I thought it was really interesting, Alistair, how you mentioned that the 5 freedoms were sort of originally designed to be catchy and very well sort of disseminated. And that's something we'll come on to a little bit later as well. But I think that's really important, is that they are, would you say, a sort of a foundation for getting that animal welfare message across?
Well, I mean, you can only say that they have been incredibly successful. I mean, we're really saying here that they're not perfect. I mean, that's been well discussed. And
neither am I.
And we may go on to, I mean, in fact, the question here is, one of the questions from Melissa is, should freedom from hunger and thirst be adapted to the correct diet? Well, again, Falk have tried to tackle that by adding in these additional words. And I think a lot of people are kind of resistant to the idea of getting rid of this or changing it too much, because it's become, as you say, a platform or a banner. It gets across a set of principles. And indeed, the fallacies create a lot of useful discussion, which are, very relevant out there, because there's a lot of discussion to be had about how we deal with animals, and it's hard to apply strict rules, although we obviously have to, because we want to legislate as well.
Yeah. So the next question we have is from Tamsin Cooper, who is one of our MOOC students. And Tamsin sent in loads of questions, which is great, but we have other questions as well. So I'm going to address one of your questions now and hopefully come back to some of the other ones. And this is a really difficult question. Looking forward to seeing how we manage to answer it. Tamsin was saying that she was finding it very difficult, at least within the UK, to find out the legal minimum requirements for animal welfare. She was saying, I'm having trouble finding out just what is recommended and what is actually law. Government.uk links to documents just say that documents are archived, and she doesn't have access to those. She's found EU directives, but she understands that the EU directives themselves have to be incorporated into the country's law before that they can be enforced. So what actually is the law when we come to animal welfare? And this is a very, very broad question, but I think a really good one to start off with, because the 5 freedoms have this history of coming from Professor Bramble's report into the condition of UK livestock, which was a government-ordained report. They do have a history of being referenced in recommendations, certainly, if not in legislation directly. And it is very difficult to get your head around legislation. It's something that I find very difficult, and technically it's supposed to be part of my job. So we're looking right now on our other screen at the Animal Welfare Act of 2006, which is the sort of latest act for the UK legislation. And I'm sorry for concentrating on UK legislation for our international viewers, but we have a limited amount of time today. A whole legislation hangout could be a different thing entirely. And the Animal Welfare Act in 2006 actually incorporates a number of other acts that were previously within the legislation, such as, for example, there's the Welfare of Farmed Animals regulations. I believe the Wildlife Act is referenced, the Welfare of Animals at Markets Order 1990. So all sorts of other regulations and acts are referenced within the Animal Welfare Act of 2006. One of the things about the Animal Welfare Act of 2006, one of the really interesting things from our point of view, is that it encourages the people who are responsible for the animals, so not just the legal owners, but whoever is responsible for the upkeep of those animals, to provide good welfare. So it's not just the preventing of poor welfare, but the provision of things that an animal needs to have good welfare. So Tamsin, for what actually is law, it differs from country to country. It's not always easy to find out. If you are ever, in your own country wondering what the regulations are, I would encourage you to contact whoever your own government representative is. In the UK, we would have our MPs, and ask them what the sort of regulations are, because they're the ones that should know that sort of thing. I don't know if you want to say anything about the Animal Welfare Act, or? Yeah,
as far as our regularly apologise for being far too UK focused, but anyway. So as far as we're concerned in the UK, the Animal Welfare Act 2006, and there's a separate one in Scotland, it's called the Animal Health and Welfare Act, but they are broadly similar, in fact, very similar. It was intended to do a set of very useful things, and as Jill says, I view it as a real landmark change in our legislative approach to animals, and indeed it may be the pinnacle. We may come on to discuss this. Maybe everything's going to be downhill from now on, I don't know, but it really was a very, very important act. But it was also intended to be a sort of umbrella, so that other acts relating more specifically to farm animals or fish, if they were outside of being farm animals, or pets or whatever, would sit within that umbrella. So for example, Jill mentioned the act which followed the 2006 Animal Welfare Act in England. It's called the Welfare of Farmed Animals England Regulations 2007. If you go onto the gov.uk website, you can link directly to this. So it is there, it is accessible, it's not archived.
I'll try and post some links to these in the comments of the YouTube video if you go and look for them later.
So just scrolling down this, you get a set of schedules relating to the different farm animals. So I'm now looking at the pig one, but there's for laying hens and broilers and so on. And so I'm just seeing right at the top here, tethering, Article 3, no person responsible for a pig may tether it or cause it to be tethered, except whilst undergoing an examination, test, treatment, or operation carried out for any veterinary purpose. So this reflects the UK position on this housing approach to pregnant sows, which was called tethering, where the pregnant sow was restrained with a neck collar throughout her gestation, actually almost from the start of the gestation right till about 5 or 6 days before she was about to give birth, when she was transferred to another close confinement system called the farrowing crate. That was outlawed and phased out in 1999 in the UK. It continues to be a big topic of conversation between farmers and policymakers and scientists about whether that was the right decision or not, but that decision was made, and that is reflected here in the specific legislation relating to pigs. So I think, in short, I can well understand your confusion over this, because I do think that particularly the UK Gov website could do with clearing up on some of this stuff. But if with a bit of work, you should be able to find your way through to specific regulations. And just as we have in the UK, we have the same in the EU. So there's a set of directives, EU directives, which relate to the different farm species. And I can tell you that for example, in the EU, I think the legislation on tethering for pigs is slightly different. I think you still are allowed to tether for up to 4 weeks after insemination, and then they have to be free of tethering. So I think the information is there, but it is a good question. It's also a good question because we have often, in addition to the legislative aspect, we have what we call the recommendations, which are, for example, in the UK, we've got a nice set of booklets about how you should keep the different types of animals, including pigs. And that provides you with more information than you get in the acts, which are kind of trimmed down and very brief and to the point. They have to be, obviously. But the regulations contain much more information. And whilst they're not legally binding, they are used in the court of law to demonstrate competency. So I think it is part of the law that you have to have read, or to have ensured that your people have read, if you're managing people, these regulations.
Yeah. Another place where you can find some recommendations as well is
I should have said recommendations, not regulations. Recommendations,
not regulations. But any assurance scheme that accounts for animal welfare, I'm thinking, for example, Red Tractor in the UK, RSPCA's Freedom Food, their recommendations for getting the accreditation from that assurance scheme for any production animal will all be available on their respective websites. So did you have something else you wanted to say there?
Yeah, I did actually. I wanted to, are we going to cover this?
Oh, we can do.
I was interested in another of Tamsin's questions actually on selective breeding, because that raises a whole other set of issues. And all we've been discussing, and what is mainly discussed in legislative terms about animals, is how we keep them. It's about the housing or the management. How we breed them, which is the point of this question, and the question is, how is research investigating historic issues like selective breeding? I can come on to that. But it's an interesting point that the vast majority of legislative and regulatory and indeed these recommendation types of approaches focus on how we keep the animals and not on the issue of animal breeding. And that, I think, is quite a deficiency. Now, there is some EU directives on this, but they're quite general. You know, they are that you should not breed animals to their detriment. You should not breed animals to cause pain or discomfort and so on. To my knowledge, nobody, no company, no farmer has ever been successfully prosecuted on the basis of what they've done through selective breeding. And yet, and I can come on to this, there's pretty clear evidence that selective breeding at times has certainly not been to the animal's advantage, and you could argue to their significant disadvantage. So that seems to me a whole can of worms, actually, that could do with more opening up and more exploration.
Yeah.
And the Farm Animal Welfare Council, when I sat on it, produced a report, I think in 2004 on this, and suggested that in the UK, we actually had a separate body whose purpose was to look at the effects of breeding and to make recommendations about where we should go with particular forms of selective breeding. And I'm afraid to say that was never taken up by government. So we remain in this funny position where how animals are bred kind of is almost underneath the radar. It's not being dealt with appropriately, I don't think. Just onto what we know research-wise, we know, for example, that the selection of dairy cows to produce, I mean, Joe knows a lot about this. Dairy cows now produce vastly more milk than they used to, over 10,000, 11,000 litres per year, compared to what they might have been, which is 2,000 or 3,000 litres. Much of that is down to selectively breeding, in this case, interestingly enough, bulls. Of course, bulls don't milk, but they do their daughters milk, and the information is then fed back up to the farmer, who then makes a selection on the basis of bulls whose daughters produce more milk. And as long ago as the mid-1990s, we've known that if we select specifically for bulls whose daughters produce more and more milk, that we will lead to genetic predisposition for susceptibility to a range of ailments like lameness and mastitis, milk fever, and even reproductive failure. Now, actually, that information is so obvious now and so costly to the farmer that the whole thing has changed. And now dairy farming is going back the other way and breeding quite strongly now for cows which are more functional, more healthy, and that, of course, is good for their welfare. So in fact, in the case of the dairy cow, that is a story of how research has illuminated the problem and action has led to improvement. But of course, when you come to, I mean, the question here is also about broiler breeders. These are the chickens that we eat, which now grow to the weight at which we kill them and eat them at around about half of the age they were when I was a boy.
You mean 5 years ago, Alistair?
Well, maybe a little bit longer ago. And, but not that long ago, actually. So it's happened very fast, and they are growing very fast. And there's a range of ailments, again, have been associated with this fast growth. But not exactly the same action has been taken. I mean, some action has been taken, and some companies are clearly better at this than others. But, you know, the state of the modern broiler chicken is one which is worthy of debate. You know, have we done the right thing there?
I think also, you mentioned there some companies being better than others. do you think it's worthwhile sort of just talking a little bit about how companies hold genetic patents? You know, they patent breed lines of chickens, and then they own that breed line, and the farmers, it's almost like a rental contract to breed those birds and produce those birds. The farmers themselves are not actually the ones directing the breeding. It's actually mostly, I would say, companies who are directing the breeding. Even within dairy cattle, that's you don't tend to have the farmers who are actually producing the produce that we eat or consume are not the ones that are directing this breeding. It comes from more of an economic company perspective. And we, within SRUC and within animal welfare science in general, are really keen on working with these companies in trying to incorporate animal welfare science into the breeding indices and selection. And in fact, within SRUC, we have a brand new team, which I have forgotten the name of, Integrative Systems, is that it?
Something like that. Yeah.
Led by Professor Eileen Wall. And it's a brand new team. I'd really love to get one of them actually one day to come and do something and talk about animal welfare and how genetics can work together, really. But it's a huge topic and definitely something that I think is going to be growing as we go forward.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, great questions, Tamsin. I'd just like to remind you that you can use the Hangout app if you're watching on Google Plus to ask us questions live. If we say something that you are really interested in or that you don't quite understand, do let us know. So we kind of summarised a little bit about the past, and already you've kind of started talking about some of the current challenges and future challenges, but I'd like to sort of move on to some questions addressing things which are more about what are the challenges animal welfare faces at the moment. So we have two questions which I thought were quite similar. So we had one from Karen Gray, who works for a rabbit welfare organisation, and one from Emmeline Hannelly, again, I apologise if I say anybody's name wrongly, who's from the British Horse Society. So Karen was saying, you know, there are legal requirements for the owners of all domesticated animals, companion animals. It's clear when it comes to rabbits, these requirements are rarely, if ever, enforced, and as such leads to high levels of unintentional neglect, stemming largely from a basic misunderstanding towards, in the case she's talking about, specifically rabbit welfare needs. And Emmeline's asking, what do we believe are the biggest welfare challenges currently in the UK, and what are the resolution to improving the problems? I think communication of the animal welfare challenges is one of the big challenges that actually faces us, and communicating what it is that we want from our animal carers, which kind of comes back to this idea of the 5 freedoms themselves being very catchy, being something which are really easy to disseminate, but are they necessarily getting the right message across? Are they helping, are they fully helping people to understand what it is that their animals need? That's quite an interesting question. There are other animal welfare frameworks out there. One of the ones that we'll talk about a little bit later is David Mellor's 5 domains. But these are often a bit more complex, a bit more difficult to communicate readily. Turning to Karen's question specifically, so she was saying, even though there are legal requirements for companion animals, she was saying specifically for rabbits, people very rarely get have these regulations enforced. Well, the RSPCA say that the Animal Welfare Act of 2006 has been really instrumental in helping them to bring more cases of animal neglect, particularly companion animal neglect, to court. And again, because the Animal Welfare Act allows for the provision of good welfare as well as just avoiding poor welfare. Mm-hmm. So it's been very instrumental for them. I don't specifically know enough about rabbits to be able to say whether or not this has helped them, but I know that rabbits are getting lots of attention at the moment because of their huge popularity as companion animals at the moment. And as you rightly identified, not a huge amount of information out there on how, well, there is a huge amount of information out there on how best to keep them, but encouraging prospective owners to seek that information out before they get a rabbit is a little bit difficult, as you yourself know. And this is kind of part of what we're trying to do with the SRUC's behaviour and welfare team, where we're trying to make it much easier for people to access the science behind this. So, for example, getting people like Professor Lawrence to come and talk and archive this Hangout on YouTube, hopefully will really just improve people's access to the science behind these kind of decision-making processes, essentially. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about specific challenges to specific species at the moment.
We'll probably come on to the future and some of the more general challenges, which probably better keep. Just on rabbits, I have to admit I'm not a great rabbit expert. I would say in terms of, I'd kind of back up what Jill's saying there in terms of the companion animal aspect of rabbits, which are obviously often kept by, well, they'll be kept by families, and kids will be involved. And our work with young kids, and to a degree with adolescents as well, really demonstrates what Jill is saying, that their understanding of animal needs in the context of the 5 freedoms needs work. I mean, it's not that they don't have the basics, but they focus, kind of like the first couple of questions we had actually, they tend to focus on things like food and water, and they don't see the other needs so readily. So they will clearly need, I think, more education on that. They need knowledge, basically, to start with. And then we need to kind of better understand their attitudes and empathetic responses as well. So we know that when we move from the 11, 12-year-olds through to the adolescents, that there is a dipping in attitudes and empathy towards animals. And we've charted that a couple of times now. So we're fairly certain that is something that's happening. And there's a whole lot of reasons why it's happening, probably, not least that young people are moving towards having other interests, not just their pet rabbit. But we need to kind of develop packages of interventions, both in primary school and secondary school, which are appropriate to the problem, which is better understanding of animal needs, better understanding the animal's perspective, but also the human side, you know, how you're going to cope and cater for the fact that young people are changing as well. We need to interact those two and get much more, well, maybe not much more, but certainly tinker and refine the approaches we're currently using.
I would love it if the public had an understanding that animal welfare is a science, and that we go out there, we find evidence behind these things. You know, they're not just spurious things that come off the top of our heads. We've gone out there, we've done the research, and I would absolutely love it if one of the main things we could achieve is getting everybody, children, adults, absolutely everyone in the public, to understand that animal welfare science has evidence behind the things it's claiming. And that would be, for me, an absolute brilliant, huge leap forward. Because I think at the moment, animal welfare is very much tied in with animal rights, which is an ethical viewpoint, and is perhaps considered just a little bit fluffy and not necessarily always acknowledged as being objective, which it can be.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah. And just on rabbits, because we just talked about the companion animal side of rabbits. I mean, of course, rabbits are also eaten and farmed for that in other countries mainly, and
also for fur.
Yeah, and there are big issues there. So, and that, from our work as well with the children, I think raises a really interesting conundrum, which relates back to what Jill was saying about how we better communicate. So in a way, communicating about companion animals, pets, rabbits, cats, dogs, is complex, but I can sort of see ways forward with that more readily perhaps than with farm animals, because we have this immediate connection with the animal in our house, and it's just more easy to engage with that sort of that relationship, because there is a relationship. But with farm animals, well, there isn't really, because we now have farmers looking after tens of thousands sometimes of animals in one go. That's obviously chickens, but even with dairy cattle now, we're talking about very large farms and, you know, limited number of stock people looking after animals. So, you know, the immediate connection between the human and the animal is very much diminished. And then you've got the additional problem, which is that the people who are actually consuming the products are even more removed. So, you know, trying to understand how to get consumers better understanding of the issues, and in a scientific sense, not in a just in an emotional sense. You know, what are the hard facts as best we know them, and what are the real issues we need to deal with, and then getting people to care about it when there's a distance between them and these animals. That seems to be a massive challenge.
A huge challenge, definitely, and not one that has an easy answer. I am conscious of time, so I'm going to push us forwards a little bit here. We have a couple of interesting questions so we have one from Rita Brock, who is working with a welfare organisation in South Africa, and a similar sort of question from Teresa Cox, who's an undergraduate at Moulton College. So Rita was asking, is speciesism inherent within the 5 freedoms? So she was saying speciesism, for those who aren't aware, is where humans tend to put some species higher up on the scale of things we care about than others. So, for example, members of the public might be more willing to care about a dog than a snail, for example, or more willing to care about a dog than a pest species such as a seagull. So this is speciesism, this ranking of species of something that's not necessarily evidence-based. And Rita was wondering, is speciesism inherent within the 5 freedoms? She would really like to address whether or not some animals are falling in between the cracks of domestic and wild animals. And Teresa was asking, can the 5 freedoms be adapted for use in wildlife as well? I'm really interested in this question. I used to work with the RSPCA as a wildlife assistant in one of their wildlife hospitals down in Chester. And it was really because I was a behavioural ecologist, it was my first real exposure to animal welfare. And for me, coming from this behavioural ecologist, this very traditional biology science background, where animals in the wild, you were not responsible for them because they were out there, they were in the wild, living as evolution has intended, and you were not responsible for them. And that was very much my background as a scientist. And coming into working with the RSPCA, where we then took responsibility for those animals when they were injured or orphaned, and trying to ensure that they had the right level of care and could then be reintegrated back into the wild, was a really big thing for me, actually. It was something that I'd never experienced before, and made me think about, how does animal welfare relate to wild animals? So again, coming back to the Animal Welfare Act of 2006 and how it also takes on the Wildlife Management Act, I think it's called. I might have to double check the name of that one, which is a 1990 act, if I remember correctly. When we take responsibility for an animal, so if we take an animal under our care, then we are responsible for its welfare. So the moment you start managing an animal, because it's injured, because it's been orphaned, then you must start providing it appropriate bedding, appropriate nutrition, appropriate housing, all of these things in order to give it good welfare. And the RSPCA is, as rehabilitators, as wildlife rehabilitators, they're very much of the opinion that that animal should be released into the wild when it's at a stage where it can fend for itself, when it's able to look after itself, and if it's not able to look after itself, they don't believe that these animals should be kept in captivity. Other wildlife rehabilitators disagree. It's a bit of an ethical question going on. Should you keep an animal in captivity that was born in the wild afterwards? So that's a sort of an ethical conundrum there. But I would say that the 5 freedoms do apply to wild animals. They do apply to any animal that we take responsibility for, even though they came from production animals. But that's my opinion on that. I don't know if you would have a different one.
I think an animal is an animal, and you'd think we should have a common set of principles to apply to all animals. So the the question of speciesism is a very good one. And of course we don't. I mean, animal welfare is just riven with conundrums and conflicts and disparity. The rat, what a perfect example. You know, the laboratory rat has got regulations governing its use and its management and its housing and what we can do to it as long as you're armed. And yet, you know, you get rats in your house, you're not going to hang around before you start thinking about how to get rid of them. And I would be the same. So, and of all the animals, actually, you know, I was brought up on a farm, and it's strange, isn't it? But of all animals, I have a bit of a thing about rats. It's their tails. Although, interestingly, one of my son's friends was keeping rats, and he said, here. And before I knew it, I had a rat crawling around me, and actually, it wasn't too bad.
They're lovely.
Yeah.
They're really, really intelligent.
It's the big Norwegian.
Rattus rattus, is that one?
No, they're just the kind you get in farms. Whatever. I think I don't know. Brown rats. I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyway, I diverge. There are in fact scientifically different perspectives on this, and those people who have approached animal welfare more from the wild animal perspective. And I wonder whether this is where the question from Rita's coming from, because she is involved with feral cats. So I wonder whether what she's seeing is a sort of a bit of a complexity there, where on the one hand, you've got these 5 freedoms, which are about this very close management of animals. And on the other hand, what does it mean if you've got an animal which is a bit more free of our management and requirements, and right up the extreme of it being a wild animal? So people who have come at it from the wild animal perspective have tended actually to place much more reliance or focus on the animal's own reliance. You know, so for example, that you cannot really assess the welfare of a wild animal or a feral animal without taking into account its own, what we call adaptive capabilities. In other words, what it can do for itself. And where we need to be concerned is where it can no longer solve the problem, often caused by humans, and we need to step in order to augment support. So that tends to be in a bit of a divergence. In fact, if you're interested, and Jill, I can give to Jill if she can't find them, there's a couple of recent reports produced by an ethicist and by a scientist on wildlife welfare, produced for Scottish National Heritage, SNH. So we can give you access to this, and they're very, very interesting reading, actually, along this sort of line.
Yeah, they sound very interesting. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, or at least shows you where science slightly disagrees, or
we always disagree.
Yes, disagree. Conflicts maybe is a better word. So I'm going to push on now, because there's a question that's come up on the chat, and I've moved the mouse over here, and it's from Gianluca. I hope I'm saying that right. Who was saying, Gianluca would like to know our opinion on a very specific topic. What do we think of infrared thermography as a non-invasive welfare method to assess animal welfare in different species? It's a Friday afternoon. My reading skills have left me. I apologise. And if it's used in the UK, what are some common use, for example, within sheep, goat and cattle? Now, we in the Animal Behaviour and Welfare team at SRUC love infrared thermography. We have 2 people who wrote the book on it, essentially. It was a book. They wrote the book on it. And that's Professor Malcolm Mitchell. He's a professor, isn't he?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. And Marianne Farish. And they are really good at using this new tool. So for those of you who don't know what infrared thermography is, it's essentially a camera which looks at the infrared spectrum of light. So right now we're all looking at the visible spectrum of light, and further along this spectrum is the infrared section. And the camera can pick that up. So it's seeing things that we can't. It's very often thought of as being heat detection, which is sort of close enough to right, so we'll go with that. But if you want to be very specific, it's looking at light radiation. And it can be used for things like detecting illness in animals. So we use it specifically looking at injuries in horses, for example, particularly race horses, who are very, very high maintenance animals in that sense. When they have an injury, it can appear hotter, so you can detect where there are heat spots in the horses. Also able to use infrared thermography to look at where a saddle is sitting on a horse, and if there's applying uneven pressure, that will come up as hotter than another area as well. But we also use it within cattle to look at lameness, if there's any swelling associated with lameness conditions. And we're investigating the use of thermography in really all sorts of disease detection, but also using it for things like, is it a way of rapidly assessing animals who are out on the field, out at pasture, a way that you can assess those animals very quickly without necessarily bringing them all in. So trying to speed up the process of welfare assessment, if that makes sense. And it also ties into another question that we had from Peter Janouge. Again, I apologise if I say these names wrong, who was interested in using novel techniques such as calcium chloride castration, which is chemical castration. And he was talking about trap, neuter, return programs using these chemical castrations. Animal welfare research is a really current theme at the moment, looking at, better is maybe not the best word I'm trying to find, but novel and reliable animal welfare assessment measures. To be a reliable animal welfare assessment measure, it has to measure something that we know relates to welfare. So we typically talk about measures being animal-based indicators. That would be things like body condition or presence of injury on an animal, things that is on the animal essentially. We talk about resource-based measures. So that's things like providing food and water. Is there adequate water provision? Does the animal have enough room to lie down? And we talk about management-based measures, and that's things like at what point will the manager of this animal or the person, the caretaker of this animal, choose to give the animal pain relief? So for example, within cattle, do they get pain relief for dehorning, things like that? I don't know if there's anything you want to say about novel techniques, and it's a very current trend in animal welfare, I would say.
Yeah, it's massive. Well, as big as you get. And just on the heat recognition with thermography, you mentioned, I think it's all the uses were physical, but there's also interest in its use to assess emotional state. Yeah. So measuring the heat of the eye, as Jill said, it's an indirect measure, but it pretty much equates. People are trying to validate that against other measures of emotional state like anxiety or fear. So that's an additional use of that. And just in general, I talked a little while ago about mega farms, more and more animals needing to be looked after by fewer and fewer trained individuals. And some people see the use of technology and sensors as being a way of buffering that problem. So if we can get the appropriate sensors, and if we can validate them so that we're sure that they're telling us something that's relevant about the animal, then that could be a way of dealing with the fact that we've got less and less people actually looking after the animals. So yeah, I have a degree of, well, why wouldn't I be cynical? I'm Scottish after all. And old and Scottish. So I have a little bit of skepticism about it, because I think it might just be a way of, buttering things up to make us feel reassured. But if people can get it to work and we can test it appropriately and validate it, then my cynicism will be washed away, and this could be a very exciting future in some ways.
I think that's a really good point that you make, actually. So as scientists, we do something called peer review, where we get papers from other scientists and we review those papers anonymously. We look at what they did and we say whether or not we think this paper is suitable for publication. I recently had one for peer review, and it was looking at essentially a big data thing, looking at how a novel method of measuring something. And as I was reading it, it was a really interesting paper, but they did leave out a few things which I think are very important. So things about the methodology when we're using things like biotelemetry. So for example, I did a lot of activity monitoring in my PhD. And there's lots of things that I think are really important that you have to continually mention when you're talking about these things. For example, how often does the device you're using actually sample the animal? So if you have a pedometer in your phone, it's probably actually sampling what's happening on your phone, or on your, if you have like an Apple Watch, it'll be sampling at a rate of 16 hertz or 4 hertz, which is 4 times a second hertz per second. And these little things, you know, they seem really obscure, but they're actually very important from a scientific methodology perspective to make sure that we're standardizing the science across a range of different papers. And these are all sorts of things that should be reported when we're looking at novel techniques. So for example, coming back to the infrared thermography, our colleague Maz, who is the absolute genius with our infrared camera, is very, very good at calibrating the camera to look at the right thing, because you've got to take into account the temperature of the surrounding area and the temperature of the animal, the difference between those two things, and how easily these can all be constructed together into one big picture to actually give us the data. And Maz is very strict on reporting that, as well as I would be about my interest, which is activity monitors. So again, coming back to this idea of, you know, this is a science. This is a very methodical science that we do, where we try to investigate what actually indicates animal welfare. And there's a lot of quite complicated work going in there. It's a very multidisciplinary science, animal welfare science, I would say. But I'm going to stop talking about that because I could rant for hours, and I'm not going to. Oh. I think this is a really good question from Lewis, who's saying, is measuring some kind of behaviour of the animal still the forefront of animal welfare assessment? Yes. I think would be my simple answer to that. Do you think there's an argument for saying something else would be a better measure?
Well, maybe yes and no a bit, but probably yes. I'd side with you. I mean, Marion Dawkins, I think it was, who you may have heard of, is she's one of the sort of founders of the science that we call animal welfare science, and she famously came up with the idea of using preference tests and getting animals to vote with their feet was the sort of jargon of the time, and she wrote a paper in '84 where she said something like behavior is special as a scientific discipline because it tells you something about the animal that you simply cannot get from, say, physiology or gene expression or whatever. And I think Jill's right. I mean, I think the important thing about behavior is it gives context for other measures, which if you don't have, I mean, there's been a lot of debate, for example, about the use of stress hormones like cortisol, and how, cortisol goes up when you're so-called stressed, but it also goes up when you're excited. So how do you discriminate between those two states? Well, the obvious way is to combine it with behavior, because behavior can, oops, we've got a drill just started up.
Exactly.
Behavior allows you to better discriminate between those two states because it gives other information. And actually, taken to its extreme, our colleague Francois Wiemersfelder has come up with an approach which is not universally approved of by scientists, but it tries to make maximal use of this additional information that we get from behavior by asking observers to qualify what they're seeing in terms of not what the animal is doing physically, but how the animal is behaving. What is the expressive quality of the behavior? And when you ask observers to do this, what you always get from a whole range of different people that we've tried this with is adjectives, qualitative terms like happy, content, relaxed, angry, pushy, calm, content. And now, those are terms which scientists really don't like very much because they run the risk of being anthropomorphic and putting onto animals human values and attributes. But Francois has spent a lot of time actually demonstrating the scientific validity of these terms. And I think that is making the maximal use of the information that we can glean from animal behavior.
Yeah. While I say, I do think animal behavior is probably the forefront, it's probably not something that for a full welfare assessment that we would ever suggest should be the only measure. There should always be a combination of measures. And that's coming back to this idea of there being animal-based measures where behavior would fall into, resource-based measures, what is available to the animal, and management-based measures, what are the extra things that we put onto the animal's situation. I would always any welfare assessment that I would do, I would try to incorporate all three of those things to get the best and full-most picture. We are coming towards the end, so I've got two really good questions that I would like to address. One of them I think you're very interested in. This is from Ellie Sutton, who's one of our younger viewers. She's 16 years old. Great to see young people interested in science as well. And Ellie is saying that she's really interested in climate change and particularly the impact that animal farming has had on our environment. So trying to maximize production in a climate efficient way, so trying to reduce the number of greenhouse gases that are emitted and also things like nitrate runoff from farms. But can we also maximize animal welfare at the same time? And how do we address those two things? Are they in competition with each other, or can they both be harmonized to produce a good environment for everyone, I suppose, in the next 50 years? Okay.
I have thought about this quite a lot, and I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but I'll give you a précis in a couple of minutes of how I see it. I think they are in conflict, and they're in conflict for one particular reason, which Jill hinted at there, which is that in order to minimize the production of greenhouse gases and other pollutants, and to otherwise make animal production more compatible with our long-term environmental strategies, we need to make animal production more efficient. And that means getting more out of less. And this term that you may have come across called sustainable intensification kind of wraps that up in a new concept which policymakers love. And it is effectively saying we're going to try and get more from less. And by less, we mean we're going to cause less harm to the environment despite getting more out of farming. So how will that happen? Well, one way it could happen in animal terms is that we focus production down into smaller areas. So we minimize the harm to large areas of land. And that means more housing for animals. And we'll also make the animals more efficient, because the more efficient an animal, the less damage potentially it's doing to the environment. And I think that those two things are actually fairly, well, they're not inevitably, but they are potentially in conflict with animal welfare. So we will have larger and larger farms. And just the other week, I came across a report on the creation of 100,000 cow dairy in China, which is being built just across the border from Russia. You remember, Russia is currently unable to get milk products from Europe. So it's turned to China to provide it with these. And China is producing mega dairy farms to provide those milk products to Russia. 100,000 cows. I don't know what the average dairy herd size in the UK is, but it's probably around about 400 or 500.
That's, yeah, on the large side, yeah.
And we had an 8,000 cow dairy wanting to be built in Nocton. I don't know if you remember that story. Well, that was turned back by planners I understand from a student actually that 1,000 cow dairy in Wales has just been approved, but they're still tiny compared to 100,000 cows. So that process of ever larger farms condensed, focused into smaller areas, plus increasing the efficiency of animals. I mean, where that has been applied in general, it's been in general bad news for farm animals. So my solution, I think, is that there is only really one solution, and that is we have to consume an awful lot less animal products. And if we do that, then we automatically solve the environmental problem, because we are using many less animals, and therefore we're producing many less of the problems that we're talking about. And because we're reducing the problems through eating and consuming less, then that means that we can keep the animals in better conditions as well. It's the only solution I can see. Yeah. But it's obviously not a politically acceptable one at the present time. Nobody's talking about this. But all the talk at the moment is producing more and doing it more efficiently. And I think, as far as animal welfare is concerned, that's just not going to work.
I think this ties in to a One Health attitude, to global human health as well. We as consumers of all types of food really need to think about the kind of food that we consume, how much of it we consume, how much of it we waste as well. You know, and these are all questions that tie together with climate change and with animal welfare. The One Health approach is really saying that everything ties in together. And I think that's very true when it comes to animal welfare and global farming. We also have one other question from Julie Pillay, who's one of our International Animal Welfare Ethics and Law students. And I think this is a sort of a good question to try and round off the debate with. So Julie was asking, what can be done to make the 5 freedoms a greater part of the animal welfare lexicon in other parts of the world? So for example, outside of the UK. She was mentioning that very few people in the US that she talks to are aware of the 5 freedoms, and she's only really aware of one animal welfare advocate who's raised it. Now the 5 freedoms are used in the US, but yeah, they're possibly not as well known as they are within the UK. And I'd kind of like to tack on to that question, a sort of secondary question, maybe just for a bit of debate. Have the 5 freedoms served their purpose? Should we retire them and move on to do something else? Or do they still hold a purpose for the next 50 years? Should we still be using these 5 freedoms and promoting them? I would say in their favour, they are very catchy. They do provide a good foundation for animal welfare. And yes, they're not perfect. Yes, they have weaknesses. Things that, for example, the 5 domains of animal welfare have tried to address by turning it on its head to be more about providing positive welfare, much like the Animal Welfare Act of 2006 has kind of turned the situation around to focus on positive welfare. Does that mean that we should sort of resign it to the last 50 years and not talk about it again?
Retire it like me.
Oh, I would never say such a thing.
That's what she was getting. Well, I'm interested actually that that they haven't kind of hit the US. I thought the Humane Society for America used them a bit, at least.
I think they do, as far as I'm aware.
The OIE, which is the World Animal Health Organization, based in Paris, I think still base their animal welfare strategy around the 5 freedoms. And they, I think, are a body encompassing the vast majority of countries in the world. I mean, I think they have 170 members. So most countries in the world sign up to the OIE, and all countries in the OIE have signed up to the OIE animal welfare standards. And I think those are based, well, we'll need to check, but I think they're based around the 5 freedoms. So I suppose, as usual, if we're going to continue with them, and it's hard to come up with an argument not to, actually, because I think to try and change horses at this point, I basically think we're having a difficult enough time promoting animal welfare, as I was just alluding to. with the, the potential conflict with the environment. That, this would further muddy the water. I think it could only put the whole argument back. So that alone, I think we need to continue with them. That's not to say that we can't improve them by, these words that explain what they're about, and also have wider debates like this, and obviously, much bigger debates than this, and particularly in countries which are not using them. And to do it through organizations like the OIE, the FAO, which is part of the United Nations. They have a gateway website. All these international efforts to try and get across these concepts could be used alongside, the use of NGOs like HSA, and also we've got our own in this country. So personally, it kind of goes back to something we were talking about earlier, that education is pretty much essential here, and education about the 5 freedoms, their fallacies and their benefits and what they mean and so on, I think has to be the way forward. And combining that with some realistic assessment of where we really are going with animals, and just coming up short really when we think that we can get everything. We can't. We're going to have to make choices here, and I think there's some hope there, because I think there is a general, in many parts of the world, there's a genuine appreciation of animals, and when people understand that they have to make choices of the sort that would lead to significant animal welfare problems, then perhaps they will begin to reconsider their position.
Yeah, I think that's a very lovely way to end it, Alistair. Well done. I knew I was right choosing you to come along to this. I just want to sort of say a few things before we finish up. Firstly, we're really keen on trying to, as Alistair was saying, communicate this message and promote the animal welfare science message. If you like this, if you want to see more of this sort of thing, one thing you can do is like this video, share this video, send the link out to other people, and it lets us know that these things are valuable, and we'll do more of them in future. If you want to do something to sort of help animal welfare right now, sharing this also lets YouTube know that it's a useful video, and then they'll recommend it to more people as well. So it serves like a dual purpose. We are running, so we did this because it's World Animal Day next week, and we're running a session here in Edinburgh, and we are going to be live streaming the talks of that session on YouTube, on this channel, we hope, if we get it all sorted out. So do keep an eye out for that. It'll also be archived, I believe, for later viewing. So you'll be able to watch some of the scientists talk about their research that happens there and then. I'm really sorry that we didn't get a chance to talk about everybody's questions. There were so many really fabulous questions, ones that I really wanted to get to, but if you left me to do this, I would talk about it for hours and hours and hours, and we all have places to be on a Friday afternoon.
I was just wondering, actually, the questions that, for example, I saw a very specific question there about monitoring free-ranging dogs. Do we keep a list of these?
We don't actually. So these questions that come up are from the Google Hangout app. So if you're watching it through the Google Hangout app, then you can be asking questions at the same time. If you go to the YouTube link and post the questions underneath there, then we can actually come back to you with some resources in the comments as well. So that could be one way of doing it. Yeah,
okay. I would suggest that. Sorry if we, because we haven't obviously been able to address all of these, and I think we could help with some.
Yeah, definitely. And also, please tweet us at SRUC Research. That's our the whole of SRUC's research group Twitter handle. Because we're always keen to try and engage people more with the science, because scientists work for the public. We work for you guys, and we want to try and make sure that you guys get as much use out of the work that we do as possible. So do engage with us. We like it. Have we got anything else to say?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. So thank you very much, guys. You have been fabulous as always. Like, share and subscribe, and we will see you when we run another Hangout. I don't know when that will be. Do let us know if there's anything that you'd like us to talk about, and keep an eye on the channel. Okay, thank you very much, guys.